Hello, thanks for joining us for our True Crime series, a joint venture between Port Phillip Library Services and Sisters in Crime Australia. I'm Karina Kilmore, a journalist and crime writer. Today I'm here with Tanya Bretherton. Tanya is a writer, researcher and sociologist, and she's going to talk with us today about women who kill and the differences she's noticed between female and male murderers. Tanya, let's start with why people kill. Do women killers have different motives to men?
I think a big assumption that's often made with crime writing is that women do kill differently, that they tend to choose means that are less violent, that they're also sneakier, and that they tend to kill, I think, for very personal reasons, that for love, for revenge. Women are often characterised, I think, as being crackpots when it comes to murder. So I think what's interesting, or what the discovery I guess I've made in the books that I've written, is that looking at the question of motive from a different angle, you get a different answer. So I tend to not look at the psychology or the interior of the women that I explore. So it's not about the pathology of the perpetrator. I like to look at the big picture. So how did the person live? When did they live? What sort of society did they live in? And what did society require of them? And when you look at the question that way, it really does give you, I think, a different answer in terms of motive or reason for murder. And the answer is quite similar across all of the women that I've looked at. And they kill, I think, for very practical reasons. Women are problem solvers, and whether we might abhor that as the solution to those problems, but they're looking for an answer. And that's certainly the common theme that I've seen across the women that I've looked at.
Wow, that's fascinating. So do women choose different victims to men? And are there any differences in the weapons or methods that you've researched?
It's hard. My background's sociology, so I think a criminologist would answer that in a particular way. I don't know that much about profiling, so I don't think I'd want to comment on that. But I think what is interesting, and I guess I reference what I mentioned just a minute ago, women have a reputation, I think, for being more emotional. They're more irrational. And in the cases that I've explored, Sarah Boyd in the Suitcase Baby, for example, Yvonne Fletcher and Caroline Grills and Veronica Monti in The Husband Poisoner, they're all women that killed to produce a particular outcome. And it was often an economic one. And I think that stands in stark contrast to the reasons that men killed in the book that I wrote called The Killing Streets. So the men in that book killed in a very crazed way. They were very lust-driven killings. The men were often quite out of control. So when the question, I think, is framed in that way, women have a reputation for being irrational and emotional. Spoiler alert, they're really not. It's actually the male killers who exhibited those crazed and out of control characteristics. The women were actually quite methodical.
So does that mean that the men killed more out of passion or lack of self-control, and the women were more controlled and deliberate?
Look, certainly the people that I've looked at, using my very little pool of not generalising too much, but yeah, I mean, I think because women were killing for a reason. The Husband Poisoner, poison was the instrument that was used. But in the Suitcase Baby, it was a case of a mother killing a newborn child. And again, without, I guess, setting back from the moral reasons or the assessment we might make of why they made those choices, it was to solve a problem.
Yeah. What changes have you noticed in women killers over the decades? Because you've been following, researching this area for a very long time.
I think the true crime stories that I look at, they definitely look at the social and the economic position of women at the time the particular crimes were committed. And I think when you approach it that way, context is everything. Context really does matter. So it's not so much about what's going on inside of us, although that's part of it. There's a bigger picture. So in the case of infanticide in the 1920s, so that's really what the focus of the Suitcase Baby was about. The common theme across all of the murders that I look at within that book is that women really lacked options. Women found themselves pregnant, out of wedlock. That was a terrible spot to be in the 1920s. There was immense social stigma if you found yourself in that position, and the stigma of illegitimacy for both women, for both the woman and the child, it was lifelong. You really couldn't escape it. There was no real social welfare for women at the time, not in the way that we think of it today. And there was certainly no childcare. So if you were a single mother and you had no family support, it was pretty much impossible to survive economically and socially, because you're kind of living in a sort of exile. Look, a similar set of factors you could argue were at play in The Husband Poisoner as well. Women with limited options in the post-war era, in unhappy marriages, and pushed to what we would consider to be unthinkable, I guess, decisions. The interesting thing I think about the murders in The Husband Poisoner is some of those murders will always remain a mystery. So in the case of Caroline Grills, she's a character that a lot of people know, killed a lot of people. It does appear she killed for economic reasons in part, but I think she also killed as a way of reorganising the family in a way that was more to her liking. So it was almost like political strategy, but unfolding in the context of a family. But yeah, to some extent, we'll never really know why some of those murders occurred. Certainly,
just recap on Caroline and what she did for those who don't know.
Yeah, so in The Husband Poisoner, many of the women that I look at killed partners, which is, I think, is what we often think of as there was domestic violence, those factors that we're kind of familiar with. Caroline Grills is a serial killer, and she killed family members that were not that directly connected to her. So in some cases, she killed because there was an economic gain. So she was the beneficiary of an estate. But in other cases, we actually don't know why she killed the family members. So she attempted to kill nephews, nieces, sister-in-law, brother-in-law. And I think it's because she had beef with them as much as any other reason. So it is kind of a microcosm of political strategy in a way, because you're just reorganising things in a way that are more to your liking.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I've heard you say that you find writing true crime an act of feminism. What do you mean by that?
All of the women that I study, they're not people that in the era in which they lived, they weren't considered important women. They were often, and subsequent, really, they've been forgotten or overlooked by written history. The 1920s, for example, I had read a lot about 1920s crime in Sydney, and I was fascinated by people like Tilly Devine and Kate Lee. They're very big figures in Sydney history in terms of our true crime history, but they weren't actually typical. They were women that managed to amass power and wealth within their own kind of criminal realms. But the women I look at really were overlooked. They were disempowered effectively. So I think true crime, it gives an opportunity to look at what the personal experiences were of those women, but it also tells a bigger story about the tragedy, the suspense, the fear they experience. So all that stuff that we associate with crime writing, but it's told, if I put it this way, it will sound like I'm writing in a dry way, but there's an institutional story as well to be told. And the women in every one of my books, we can make whatever moral judgments we want to make about the choices for them to commit crimes, but they were disempowered by the societies in which they lived. And that's really rich terrain for feminist narratives.
It is, absolutely, yeah. And just one more question. How do you cope with researching the violence in the cases you've followed? And also that, just looking at the history of the disempowerment and the social implications of those women's lives, within those women's lives.
Yeah, I do think about this, and it's a question that I'm asked fairly often. Part of it is, I think, I'm not, the crimes occurred a long time ago. So I do think that gives me a little bit of a buffer, or it's like I'm viewing the events through a camera lens. Yeah. Now, photographers will have often exercise kind of a shocking capability of being able to capture things that look terrible, that are terrible. They're witness to terrible things. But there's something about viewing it through a camera lens that I think there's a level of abstraction in the way that you experience it. But that said, aspects of every book that I've written, I've definitely cried during the research process. There are horrible things that occur in the books that I've written. And in a way, I almost use that as a metric, because when I have that moment where I sort of gasp, I know that I'm onto something. Because if it's affected me, I know that it will affect readers. Yeah. That's what I hope anyway. Yeah. And there is that it compels you to write as well when you discover these things and you feel there's a story to tell, particularly about inequity, unfairness. That is the driving force, I think, behind a lot of what I write too.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. Tanya Bretherton, thanks for talking to us today. The male-female divide, even in crime, is an ongoing and age-old topic, isn't it?
It sure is.
If you'd like to find out more about Tanya, you can find her bio and website link in the information about this event series. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye to everyone.